July in West Texas was a time of surrender. The sun was not a friend. It was a hammer, beating the land flat and hard and white until the horizon shimmered with a heat that stole the breath from a man's lungs. The earth, stripped of its green memories from the brief spring rains, had cracked open in 1,000 places, looking like the parched lips of a dying sinner begging for a drop of water that would never come. The creeks and riverbeds were ghosts, their paths marked only by bleached stones and the brittle, skeletal remains of last year's reeds. Cattle, what was left of them, were walking skeletons draped in hide. They stood listlessly in the meager shade of stunted mesquite trees, their ribs a harsh accordion against their flanks. Their heads hung low as if in prayer for an end to the ceaseless torment. Vultures circled high in the cloudless, unforgiving sky, patient as undertakers, their black shapes a constant reminder that in this land, life was a temporary arrangement and death was the only certainty. Into this crucible of dust and despair, the daily stagecoach from the east was a violent intrusion. It arrived in the town of Redemption in a cloud of its own making, the iron-shod wheels grinding on the baked earth, the leather straps groaning like a man on the gallows. The horses, lathered in sweat and foam, trembled with exhaustion, their sides heaving. Redemption itself was little more than a collection of sun-warped wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty loneliness that surrounded it. A general store with peeling paint, a blacksmith's forge that rang with a tired, percussive rhythm, a saloon that smelled of stale beer and desperation even from the street, and a church whose steeples seemed to point an accusing finger at the indifferent sky. When the stage door swung open with a pained squeal, the first thing to emerge was a worn, black boot, scuffed at the toe but meticulously clean. It was followed by the hem of a dark gray dress, practical and devoid of any lace or frippery, its fabric heavy despite the suffocating heat. Finally, the woman herself descended, moving with a stiff, deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the lazy, heat-drugged stupor of the town. She was not a young girl, but not yet old. Perhaps 30 years had passed over her, though the lines of fatigue around her eyes and the tight set of her mouth suggested they had been hard years. Her face was pale, a stark contrast to the sun-darkened faces of the few townsfolk who bothered to watch the arrival. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe bun that allowed no stray wisps to escape. She carried a single, small carpet bag, clutched in a hand that was slender but showed the telltale signs of hard work in its knuckles. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the blinding glare, her posture unnaturally straight, as if held up by a rod of iron will. This was Eliza Mayhew, a widow from a world of green hills and gentle rains, a world that had chewed her up and spat her out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a name scrawled on a piece of paper. The name was Wade Hawthorne. The paper was a letter confirming employment as a cook on his ranch. The Triple H. She had traveled for weeks, trading the soft humidity of the east for this dry, abrasive heat, propelled by the simple, brutal engine of necessity. She was destitute, and this job was not a choice. It was the last rung on a ladder she couldn't afford to fall from. The station master, a man whose skin was the texture of old leather, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ma'am," he grunted, his voice raspy. "Looking for someone." Eliza's voice, when it came, was quiet but clear, with the clipped accent of the East that sounded foreign and delicate in the thick Texas air. "I am here to take up a position at the Hawthorne Ranch. I was told there would be someone to meet me." The man's gaze flickered with something pity, perhaps, or just idle curiosity. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Hawthorne's place. Jedediah's over there with the buckboard." He nodded toward a grizzled old man sitting slumped on a wagon loaded with sacks of flour and salt. "He'll take you out." He paused, looking her up and down once more. "It's a good ways out. Nothing much tween here and there but dust and snakes." Eliza merely inclined her head. "Thank you for your kindness." There was no kindness in his expression. Only the weary indifference of a man who had seen too many hopeful faces arrive and too many broken ones leave. As she walked toward the buckboard, the townsfolk watched. They saw a woman alone, a stranger, heading out to the ranch of a man who had not been seen in town for more than a supply run in years. Wade Hawthorne was a name spoken in low tones, a man who had carved a life out of this harsh land and had been hardened by it in the process. He had come here with a wife years ago, a pretty, laughing woman named Sarah. They had built their home with their own hands. Then, a fever had swept through, swift and merciless, and Sarah was gone. Since that day, Wade Hawthorne had retreated into himself and his land, his heart becoming as barren and unforgiving as the acres he worked. He spoke when he had to, did business when it was required. But the light in him had gone out. He was a ghost haunting his own life. The last cook he'd had, a portly man with a fondness for the saloon's whiskey, had lasted 2 months before fleeing in the night, complaining that the silence at the Triple H was louder and more terrifying than any Comanche raid. So when they saw this lone woman, this pale figure from the east, heading out to that desolate place, they saw a lamb being led to a silent, lonely slaughter. Jedediah, the old ranch hand, barely acknowledged her as she approached. He shifted a sack of beans to make a space for her on the hard wooden seat. "Ma'am," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "I am Eliza Mayhew," she said, placing her bag at her feet before hoisting herself onto the wagon. "Jedediah," he replied, and that was the end of the conversation. He clucked his tongue, and the mules, just as weary and spiritless as the man, lurched the wagon into motion. The journey from redemption to the Triple H was a descent into an even deeper silence. The sounds of the town, the blacksmith's hammer, the distant piano from the saloon faded, replaced by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the mule's hooves in the thick dust. The sun beat down relentlessly. Eliza could feel the heat seeping through her dress, her skin growing tight and dry. She sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of brown and gray that stretched before them. She saw the land not with a pioneer's hope, but with the stark realism of a survivor. She saw the lack of water, the sparse grazing, the sheer, brutal effort it must take to wring a living from such a place. It was a landscape that demanded everything and gave back nothing but a grudging existence. It was, she thought with a grim sense of irony, a fitting reflection of her own circumstances. After what felt like an eternity, Jedediah pointed a gnarled finger toward the horizon. "Triple H." At first, all she could see was a smudge against the foothills. As they drew closer, the smudge resolved itself into a collection of buildings. A long, low-slung ranch house made of dark, weathered timber sat at the center. A sturdy barn stood a short distance away, along with a series of corrals, their fences mended and strong. The place was not derelict. It was functional, maintained with a grim efficiency, but there was no softness to it. No flower beds by the porch, no whitewash on the fences, no curtains in the windows. It was a fortress, a bastion against the wilderness, but it was not a home. It was a place where someone lived, but it was not alive. As the buckboard rolled to a stop in the dusty yard, the front door of the house opened. The man who emerged seemed to have been carved from the very land he stood on. He was tall and lean, with the kind of wiry strength that comes from years of relentless physical labor. He wore dusty denim trousers and a sweat-stained chambray shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and browned by the sun. A worn Stetson was pulled low on his brow, casting his face in shadow. He walked toward them, his stride long and unhurried, the jingle of his spurs a lonely, metallic sound in the heavy silence. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and pushed the brim of his hat back with his thumb. The face revealed was all sharp angles and hard planes, a cartography of grief and solitude. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were startlingly pale in his sun-bronzed face. They held no warmth, no welcome, only a flat, assessing emptiness. He looked at Eliza as a rancher might look at a new piece of livestock, judging her worth and durability. This was Wade Hawthorne. "You're the cook?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, rough as gravel. It was a voice that hadn't been used for much more than shouting at cattle for a long time. "I am," Eliza said, her own voice sounding impossibly small in the vast yard. He gave a curt nod. "Jedediah, unload the supplies. Woman, get down." It was not a request. It was an order. Eliza swung her legs over the side of the buckboard, her boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. For a fleeting second, as her weight settled, she faltered, a slight, almost imperceptible wobble that she corrected instantly. But Wade Hawthorne's eyes missed nothing. His gaze flickered down to her feet and then back to her face, his expression unchanging. "The work is hard," he stated, his eyes boring into hers. "You'll be up before the sun and you'll finish after it's gone. There's me and 3 hands to feed. You cook, you clean the kitchen and the mess hall, you keep to yourself. You don't bring no trouble to my door." Understood. He didn't care where she came from. He didn't care what sorrows had driven her to this God-forsaken edge of the world. He didn't care about the story etched in the fine lines on her face. He had a need, a practical, gaping hole in the functioning of his ranch. He needed a pair of hands to turn flour into biscuits and beef into stew. He had hired her to be a function, a cog in his solitary machine. He had hired her, in his own mind, to cook and then disappear behind the kitchen door. Eliza met his cold gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw in his eyes a loneliness as profound and vast as the land around them. It was a desolation she recognized, for she carried her own version of it deep within her. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "Good," he grunted. He turned on his heel. "Kitchen's through there. Your room's a small one off the back of it. Don't expect much." Without another word, he strode toward the barn, his back a rigid, unyielding line. He had done his duty. He had procured his cook. The transaction was complete. Now he could return to the familiar, uncomplicated company of his cattle and his silence. Left alone in the yard, with Jedediah methodically hauling sacks from the wagon, Eliza took a deep breath. The air was hot and tasted of dust. She picked up her carpetbag, the only worldly possession she had left, and walked toward the house. The wood of the porch steps was splintered and gray. The door was heavy. As she pushed it open and stepped inside, she was met with the cool, musty smell of a place that had been without a woman's touch for far too long. A fine layer of dust coated everything. The air was still and close, thick with unspoken memories and lingering sorrow. She had not found a sanctuary. She had merely traded one prison for another. But here, at least, there was work. And for a woman like Eliza Mayhew, work was a form of prayer, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. The buckboard came to a halt with a final, weary groan of wood and leather that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the vast, waiting silence of the ranch yard. For a moment, nothing moved. The dust, stirred by their arrival, hung in the thick, motionless air before beginning a slow, lazy descent back to the earth from which it came. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders, making the very act of breathing a conscious effort. From the distant corrals came the occasional soft stamp of a hoof or the swish of a tail against hide. But these sounds only served to emphasize the profound emptiness of the place. When the ranch house door opened, it was as if the shadows within had finally decided to give up a piece of themselves. The man who stepped onto the porch was Wade Hawthorne, and he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life where no energy was ever wasted. He didn't hurry. He let his eyes sweep over the scene: the tired mules, the slumped figure of old Jedediah, the wagon laden with supplies, and finally, the woman. His gaze settled on Eliza, and it was not the look of a man seeing a woman, but of an engineer inspecting a new part for a machine. It was cold, analytical, and utterly devoid of curiosity. He catalogued her worn but clean dress, the severe knot of her hair, the way her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. He was searching for weakness, for a sign of the fragility he associated with women from the East, a sign that she would break under the immense, crushing pressure of this life he had built. He walked toward the wagon, his spurs kicking up small puffs of dust with each deliberate step. The sound was sharp, metallic, a lonely punctuation in the afternoon's oppressive quiet. He stopped a few yards away, a distance that felt both formal and dismissive, and pushed the brim of his hat back with a calloused thumb. The full force of his presence, raw and unsheltered, was now directed at her. The lines on his face were carved deep, not by age but by weather and something harsher, something that had hollowed him out from the inside. "You're the one who answered the advertisement," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of a business transaction. His voice was like stones grinding together, a sound long unused to the softer cadence of conversation. Eliza felt the intensity of his stare but did not look away. She had faced down creditors, a condescending clergyman, and the pitying looks of neighbors who had known her in a different life. This man's coldness was a familiar language, just spoken with a different accent. "I am Eliza Mayhew," she answered, her voice clear and even. "I am here for the cook's position." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if her words were an unnecessary formality. His eyes, the color of a faded blue sky just before a storm, held hers. "I don't need to know where you came from, and I don't care," he said, the words clipped and final. He was building a wall between them with every syllable. "This is my land, and this is my house. The rules are simple. You're up before dawn to start the coffee and the biscuits. You feed me and the hands 3 times a day. You keep the kitchen clean. When your work is done, you keep to your own space. I won't trouble you, and you won't trouble me." He paused, letting the weight of his decree settle in the heated air between them. "If you can cook, you stay. If you can't, the next supply wagon takes you back to town. There's no room for sentiment here. There's only work." The speech was brutal in its directness, designed to strip away any hope of comfort or companionship. He was offering her a job, not a haven. He was making it clear that her presence was a necessity, not a choice he was pleased with. He was a man who had walled off his heart so completely that he now saw human interaction as a simple matter of profit and loss, of function and failure. Eliza listened to every word, her expression unchanging. She understood the unspoken threat beneath the surface: do your job and be invisible. She had not come here seeking kindness. She had come here seeking survival. "I understand," she said. The 2 words were a quiet acceptance of his harsh terms, a promise to abide by the bleak contract he had laid out. "Get down," he commanded, then turned his head slightly. "Jedediah, get her bag, then see to the mules." Obedience was a currency she could afford to spend. Eliza moved to the edge of the wagon seat, turning to lower herself to the ground. The jump from the buckboard was a high one. She placed her hands on the edge of the seat for support, swinging her legs over the side. Her worn black boots met the ground with a soft thud. For a half second, as her full weight landed, her left leg betrayed her. It wasn't a fall, not even a stumble. It was a momentary stiffening, a subtle shift in her posture as she caught her balance, favoring the right leg just enough to betray an old injury. She pressed her lips together against a familiar, dull ache that shot up from her ankle and straightened immediately, her back as rigid as a fence post. It was a flicker of movement, a thing so small and fleeting that most would have missed it. But Wade Hawthorne missed nothing. His eyes, which had been watching her with an impatient, critical gaze, narrowed almost imperceptibly. He saw the slight hesitation, the way she momentarily braced herself before standing tall. He saw the ghost of a limp. His expression did not change. Not a muscle in his stony face moved. He did not offer a hand. He did not ask if she was all right. To do so would have been an admission of concern, a crack back in the fortress of his indifference. But for the briefest of moments, something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of something. It was not sympathy. It was a raw, unwelcome spark of recognition. He saw a flaw, a sign of damage, a piece of a story he had explicitly stated he did not want to know. A person with a history of pain was not a simple, functioning machine. They were complicated. They were unpredictable. And Wade Hawthorne had banished complication from his life years ago. Eliza felt his gaze on her, sharp and probing, and she squared her shoulders, defying the ache in her ankle and the weight of his scrutiny. She would not show weakness. She had learned long ago that the world had little use for a woman's pain. It was a burden to be carried in silence, or not at all. She met his look, her own eyes clear and steady, offering no explanation, no apology for her body's slight imperfection. The silent standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. It was a battle of wills fought in the dusty, sun-drenched yard. He, with his brute force of will, demanding she be nothing more than what he hired her to be. She, with her quiet resilience, refusing to be diminished by his assessment or her own hidden struggles. Finally, as if annoyed by the silent complication she presented, Wade broke the stare. He turned his back on her, a clear act of dismissal. "The kitchen is through that door," he said to the air, gesturing vaguely toward the house. "Your room is off the back of it. Jedediah will show you. Don't expect comfort." Without a backward glance, he strode away toward the barn, his long-legged gait eating up the ground. He was retreating back to his world of leather, livestock, and solitude. A world where things were simple and made sense. He had left her standing alone in the yard, a solitary figure in a gray dress, with the weight of his cold welcome settling upon her like a shroud. Jedediah, having unceremoniously dropped her carpetbag in the dust near the porch steps, was already leading the weary mules toward the water trough. He worked with the slow, methodical pace of a man who measured his life, not in hours, but in seasons of unending labor. He didn't speak to her again. Eliza was alone. She looked from the rigid, retreating back of Wade Hawthorne to the stoic, silent form of the ranch house. It stood there, dark and watchful, seeming to absorb the heat and the light and give nothing back. It was a house of secrets and sorrow. She could feel it. She could taste the loneliness in the air. She bent down, her movements stiff, and picked up her bag. Each step she took toward the house was a conscious act of will, a push against the screaming instinct to turn and flee back to the known miseries of the world she had left behind. But there was nothing to go back to. This was it, this stark, unforgiving place and the cold, broken man who ruled it were her last chance. As she placed her hand on the rough, sun-warmed wood of the kitchen door, she took a slow, steadying breath. She had not been hired for her story, or for her spirit. She had been hired to cook, and so she would cook. She would pour all of her pain, all of her resilience, all of her stubborn will to survive into the kneading of dough and the simmering of stews. She would make herself essential. She would make herself invisible. And she would endure. The kitchen door closed behind Eliza with a soft click, a sound of finality that echoed in the heavy, stagnant air. For a long moment, she simply stood there, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. The room was large, built to serve a once thriving ranch, but now it felt like a cavern of neglect. Dust lay thick on every surface, a fine gray powder that softened the sharp edges of the long wooden work table and the empty shelves. Cobwebs, intricate and ancient, hung from the ceiling beams like funeral shrouds. The heart of the room, a massive cast-iron stove, stood cold and silent. Its surface was filmed with rust and the residue of long-forgotten spills. One of the iron lids was cracked, and a fine web of fractures ran across the firebox door. It looked less like a source of warmth and life, and more like the tombstone of 1,000 dead fires. To its side, a cavernous hearth, big enough to roast a whole pig, was choked with the pale, compacted ash of countless previous blazes. The smell in the room was a stale trinity of cold grease, ancient soot, and the faint, sour scent of mice. A collection of pots and pans hung from the hooks on the wall. They were dented and blackened, the copper bottoms of a few showing through the grime like a faded memory of a more prosperous time. They looked like old soldiers, battered and scarred, retired from a war that had been lost years ago. This was not a kitchen. It was an archaeological site, a monument to a life that had abruptly ceased. It was the physical manifestation of Wade Hawthorne's grief. Eliza felt a weariness so profound it was like a physical weight in her bones. The weeks of travel, the uncertainty, the harsh welcome, it all culminated in this one desolate room. It would have been easy to despair, to sit on the floor and weep for the life she had lost and the bleakness of the one she had found. But tears were a luxury she had unlearned long ago. They changed nothing. They didn't fill an empty belly or mend a broken heart. Work was the only thing that had ever served her. She set her small carpetbag down on the cleanest corner of the floor. She untied the ribbons of her bonnet, hung it on a nail by the door, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she began to roll up the sleeves of her gray dress. Her hands, though slender, were capable. They had managed a household, tended a garden, and nursed a dying husband. They would manage this. Her first task was to find water. A door at the back of the kitchen led to a small, stuffy room containing a narrow cot with a thin, lumpy mattress, her new home. Another door led outside to a covered porch where a pump stood over a well. The handle was stiff with rust and disuse, and it took all her strength to work it up and down. The first water that gushed out was brown and sludgy, but she kept pumping, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, until it finally ran clear and cold. She found 2 large buckets, scoured them with sand from the yard until they were clean, and began the laborious process of hauling water into the kitchen. With each trip from the well, the ache in her left ankle sharpened, a familiar throbbing that was a constant companion. She moved with a careful, measured rhythm, her limp more pronounced with the heavy weight of the buckets, but her face was a mask of stoic determination. She set a great cauldron of water on the stove to heat, then turned her attention to the hearth. With a shovel she found leaning against the wall, she began to excavate the cold, dead ash. It was a filthy, choking job. Clouds of gray dust filled the air, coating her hair and clothes. But she worked without pause, scooping out years of neglect until she finally reached the blackened fire bricks at the bottom. Then she began to clean. She started with the stove, scrubbing it with a harsh lye soap she found in the pantry and a stiff bristled brush. She worked her way through the layers of grease and rust, her arms aching, until the black iron began to reappear. She took down the battered pots and pans, carrying them outside to scour them with sand and soap until they were fit for use again. She swept the floor, the broom raising a storm of dust that caught in the shafts of light slanting through the grimy windows. She wiped down the long work table, its surface scarred with the knife cuts and scorch marks of 1,000 past meals. Slowly, painstakingly, the room began to transform. It was no longer an abandoned tomb, but a workspace, however humble. As she worked, she took stock of her domain. The pantry was sparsely supplied, but the basics were their sacks of flour and cornmeal, a barrel of dried beans, tins of molasses, a large side of salt bacon hanging from a hook, and a few withered onions in a crate. It was a Spartan larder, the provisions of men who ate for fuel, not for pleasure. By late afternoon, the kitchen was as clean as she could make it in one day. The floor was swept, the surfaces were wiped, and a small, determined fire now crackled in the hearth, its warmth beginning to push back against the room's deep-seated chill. Eliza stood in the center of the room, her dress smudged with soot, her face streaked with grime, her hands raw. The pain in her ankle was a hot, sharp protest against the day's labor. But a quiet sense of ownership had begun to settle over her. She had not been defeated by the neglect. She had met it head-on and imposed her own order. It was time to cook. There was no time for anything elaborate. She put a large pot of beans on to simmer with a chunk of the salt bacon. She mixed a simple batter for cornbread, her movements efficient and practiced, honed by years of making do. In a heavy iron skillet, she fried thick slices of the bacon until they were crisp, the smell filling the kitchen with a rich, savory aroma that was the very essence of life and sustenance. It was the first good smell that house had known in a very long time. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, she heard the sound of men returning, the clomp of boots on the porch, the tired grunts and low-spoken words of the ranch hands. She set out 3 tin plates and mugs on the table in the small mess hall adjoining the kitchen, a room as stark and functional as the rest of the house. The 2 hands who entered were weathered men, their faces burned dark by the sun. They stopped just inside the doorway, sniffing the air like cautious animals. Their eyes widened slightly at the sight of the clean table and the smell of the cooking food. They nodded at her, a gesture of silent, surprised respect, before taking their seats. Wade Hawthorne came in last. He moved with the same contained, brooding energy she had seen earlier. He did not look at her. He did not acknowledge the transformation of the kitchen or the welcoming aroma that now filled his house. He simply took his place at the head of the table, his presence dominating the small room. Eliza served the meal, her movements quiet and unobtrusive. She filled their plates with the beans and bacon, placing a wedge of golden brown cornbread beside each one. She filled their mugs with hot, black coffee from a pot that now gleamed on the stove. Then, she retreated to the shadows of the kitchen doorway, watching. The hands ate with a hungry, focused intensity, their initial surprise giving way to a quiet appreciation. They were not men of many words, but their clean plates were praise enough. Wade ate in a profound, unnerving silence. He took his fork and methodically consumed the food, his eyes fixed on his plate. His face was unreadable, a stony mask. He did not look up. He did not speak. To an outside observer, he might have been eating alone. So completely did he seem to wall himself off from the others at the table. He was there in body, but his spirit was somewhere else entirely, lost in a wilderness of memory and grief. From her vantage point, Eliza watched him, her own hunger forgotten. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw. He was not just eating, he was performing a necessary function, refueling his body for another day of relentless work. There was no pleasure in it for him, no comfort. The fire in the stove, which she had banked to cook the cornbread, was beginning to die down, knowing it would need to be built up again for the morning. Eliza moved from the doorway back to the stove. She picked up a few small logs from the wood box. The movement required her to bend low, almost kneeling, to open the firebox door. As she crouched, the full weight of her body settled onto her bad leg. After a day of standing, scrubbing, and hauling, the ankles screamed in silent protest. Her movement was stiff, and as she reached for the poker to stir the embers, she had to place a hand on the floor to steady herself. It was a small, unconscious gesture of pain, hidden from the men in the other room, or so she thought. Wade Hawthorne had not looked up from his plate, but his attention was not on his food. From the corner of his eye, he had been tracking her movements. He saw her quiet efficiency as she served the meal, and now he saw her move to the stove. He saw the way she lowered herself, the unnatural stiffness in her posture. He saw her brace herself with her hand. He saw the subtle grimace that she quickly suppressed. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth, for a single, frozen moment. His gaze lifted from his plate and settled on her crouched form. The light from the stove's open door cast a warm, flickering glow on her face, highlighting the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. He saw not just a cook tending a fire. He saw a woman bearing a visible, physical burden with a silence that mirrored his own invisible one. The image of her faltering in the yard returned to him, now connected to this private, unguarded moment of pain. A strange, unwelcome feeling stirred in the cold, dormant recesses of his chest. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself in years, a faint echo of something that felt dangerously like empathy. He immediately crushed it, pushing it back down into the darkness where he kept all such emotions. He had no use for it. He lowered his fork and resumed eating, his expression as hard and impenetrable as before. The moment had passed, but the image remained, seared into his mind, the woman, the fire, and the silent language of her limp. After the hands had finished and left with mumbled words of thanks, Wade pushed his empty plate away. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. Without a single word or a glance in her direction, he turned and left the room, disappearing into the dark recesses of the house. Eliza was left alone in the silence, the smell of bacon and coffee still hanging in the air. The warmth from the stove was a comfort against the cooling night. She took a plate for herself and sat at the far end of the long work table in the kitchen. She ate slowly, the food tasting of ash and exhaustion in her mouth. When she was done, she cleaned the last of the dishes, banked the fire for the night, and retired to her small, bare room. She lay down on the lumpy cot without undressing, too tired to do anything more. The house was utterly silent around her. She had survived her first day. She had filled their bellies and cleaned their hearth. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the lonely cry of a distant coyote, she knew that the deepest, coldest corners of this house and of the man who resided within it were still far from her reach. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, stark and unvarying as the relentless Texas sun. Life on the Triple H was governed not by the clock, but by the light and the needs of the cattle. For Eliza, this rhythm was a crucible, a routine of ceaseless labor that began in the deep, star-dusted blackness before dawn and ended long after the last vestiges of daylight had bled from the western sky. She would rise while the house was still steeped in a profound, sleeping silence, the air cool against her skin. A single match would scratch to life, and the soft glow of her small lamp would push back the shadows in her tiny room. Each morning, her first few steps were a trial. The old injury in her ankle would be stiff and cold, sending a sharp, resentful pain up her leg. She would stand for a moment, her hand braced against the wall, her eyes closed, breathing through the initial protest of her own body. Then she would move, the limp more pronounced in these early hours, and enter the dark, cavernous kitchen. Her first act was always to coax the embers in the stove back to life. She would gently stir the ash, add kindling, and blow softly until a small, determined flame flickered and grew. This small ritual felt like a secret between her and the house. She was its new heart, and this was the first beat of the day. As the fire took hold, casting a warm, dancing light across the room she had claimed as her own, she would put the great coffee pot on to boil. The rich, bracing aroma would be the first soundless announcement that the day had begun. By the time Wade and his hands, Silas and a younger man named Tom, stumbled into the mess hall, the room would be filled with the smells of coffee, frying bacon, and hot biscuits. Eliza would be a quiet, efficient presence in the background, refilling coffee mugs, placing platters of food on the table, moving with a practiced economy that betrayed the constant, nagging pain in her leg. The men, Wade included, ate quickly and spoke little. Their talk was of branding, of a sick steer, of the ever-present lack of rain. They never spoke to her directly, beyond a gruff, "More coffee" from Silas or a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," from young Tom. Wade spoke not at all. He would eat, his gaze fixed on his plate or on some distant point beyond the window. And then he would be gone, disappearing into the vast, sun-bleached expanse of his land. The hours between breakfast and the midday meal were a blur of solitary work. Eliza would clean the morning's dishes, scrub the great work table, and begin preparations for dinner. She would knead dough for the day's bread, her shoulders and arms aching with the effort. the rhythmic push and fold, a kind of physical prayer. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the kitchen near the well, where a few hardy herbs still struggled for life. She began to tend to it, pulling weeds and hauling buckets of water, her determination to nurture life in this barren place a quiet act of defiance. She learned the sounds of the ranch, the distant, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer from the barn, the lowing of cattle, the constant whispery sigh of the wind as it swept across the plains. These sounds were her only companions. The silence within the house remained absolute. It was Wade's silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief that she had no intention of disturbing. She was a guest in his sorrow, and she knew better than to draw attention to herself. But she was being watched. Wade Hawthorne had hired a cook, a function, a pair of hands. He had not wanted a person, but a person was what he had gotten, and the small, irrefutable proofs of her humanity were beginning to intrude upon his carefully constructed solitude. He had built his life into a fortress of routine, and now a new, quiet routine was operating within his own. He began to notice it against his will. He noticed, in the pre-dawn gloom, the single steady light that shone from the kitchen window long before he himself had risen. He noticed that the coffee was always hot, always strong, always ready. He noticed that the biscuits were never burned, the beans never too salty. An order and a predictability had returned to his meals, a quiet competence that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of his own untended heart. At first, he noticed only the results of her labor. Then, he began to notice the labor itself. He would come to the house for a drink from the water barrel during the heat of the day, and through the open kitchen door, he would see her. He saw her standing over the hot stove, her face flushed, a sheen of sweat on her brow, stirring a large pot. He saw her at the work table, her movements precise as she chopped vegetables. He saw her once, struggling to lift a heavy sack of flour, her face tight with a concentration that was part pain, part determination. He saw her pause, lean against the table, and close her eyes for just a second, her shoulders slumping with a weariness so profound it was almost palpable. He had stood in the shadows of the porch, unseen, and watched this small, private moment of exhaustion. He had felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his own chest, and had turned and walked away before she could see him. He was a man who noticed details. It was how he survived. He could tell a steer was sick by the slight droop of its ears. He could read the sky and predict the weather from the shape of a single cloud. And now, this same unwilling, analytical gaze was turning toward Eliza Mayhew. He started to see the small things, the insignificant habits that made up the person. He noticed the way she pushed a stray wisp of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, never with her flour-dusted fingers. He noticed that, despite the endless grime of the kitchen, her fingernails were always kept short and clean. He noticed the way she would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and her breath would catch, just for an instant. It would be followed by a long, slow exhalation, a sigh so quiet it was barely audible. It was the sound of pain being mastered, of a sharp, sudden twinge being endured and then put away. He heard it once as she was lifting a heavy cauldron from the stove, and again as she rose from her knees after tending the herb garden. Each time, the sound was a small, sharp intrusion into his silence, a reminder of the limp he had first seen in the yard. He did not help. He did not speak. To do either would be to acknowledge that he saw her, truly saw her, not just as his cook, but as a woman in pain. And that was a line he was not prepared to cross. Acknowledgement led to conversation, conversation to connection, and connection was a door he had nailed shut and barricaded years ago. So he remained silent. He watched, and he noticed, and he kept his distance. One evening, after the hands had eaten and gone, he sat alone at the table, finishing his coffee. Eliza was at the stone sink, her back to him, washing the dishes. The setting sun slanted through the window, illuminating the steam rising from the hot water. He watched the methodical way she worked, her movements unhurried and efficient. When she was finished, she pulled the plug to let the dirty water drain, and then she refilled the basin with clean water from the pump. She submerged her hands and began to wash them, not with the quick rinse of a person finished with a chore, but with a slow, deliberate care that was almost ceremonial. She lathered a bar of lye soap, scrubbing her palms, her knuckles, the spaces between her fingers. She worked the lather up her wrists and halfway up her forearms. He could see the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as she performed this simple act. It was as if she were washing away more than just the day's grime. She was washing away the weariness, the ache, the crushing weight of her labor, reclaiming her hands as her own. The gesture was private, intimate, and profoundly revealing. It spoke of a deep, innate sense of dignity, a refusal to be entirely consumed by her circumstances. He sat there, a silent observer in the shadows, and watched until she was finished. She dried her hands on a clean cloth, and, for a moment, she stood with her back still to him, looking out the window at the darkening landscape. Then she let out another one of those long, weary sighs. Wade pushed his chair back, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Eliza startled slightly, turning from the sink. Her face was calm, her expression neutral, giving no sign of the pain or exhaustion he now knew she was feeling. She was a fortress, just as he was. He stood up, took his empty mug, and placed it by the sink. Their hands did not touch. Their eyes met for only a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, he saw the deep, settled tiredness in her gaze, and she saw the cold, unyielding wall in his. "The bread was good," he said. The words were rough, rusty from disuse. It was the first thing he had said to her that was not an order or a statement of fact. It was the closest he could come to an acknowledgement, a concession that he had noticed her work, and that it had merit. Eliza's expression did not change, but a flicker of surprise registered deep in her eyes. She simply nodded. "I'll bake more tomorrow," she replied, her voice as quiet and even as always. He turned and left her then, walking out of the kitchen and into the consuming darkness of the rest of the house. He had not helped her. He had not offered a word of comfort, but he had noticed. And in the vast, silent world of Wade Hawthorne, to be noticed was a profound and deeply unsettling change. He walked through his dark, empty house, the scent of fresh bread still lingering in the air, and felt the first unwelcome tremor in the foundations of his solitude. The sun reached its zenith, a white-hot eye in a bleached and vacant sky. The heat was no longer a simple warmth. It was a physical presence, a weight that settled on the land, silencing the birds and insects and sending shimmering, distorted waves rising from the baked earth. In this crushing stillness, the rhythmic squeak and clank of the well pump was the only sign of life, a testament to the endless, unyielding nature of the work that had to be done. Eliza had been hauling water for the better part of an hour, refilling the large barrels beside the kitchen porch that were used for cooking and washing. Her dress was damp with a mixture of sweat and splashed water, clinging uncomfortably to her back. The initial morning stiffness in her ankle had long since given way to a deep, throbbing ache, a fiery protest that grew with each trip from the well. The ground around the pump, perpetually damp, had been baked by the sun into a treacherous combination of cracked, hard earth and slick patches of dark mud. She worked in a state of determined mindlessness, her thoughts narrowed to the simple, repetitive task at hand. Pull the handle down, feel the resistance, hear the gush of water, fill the bucket, lift, walk. The world had shrunk to this small, grueling circle of effort. She had filled 3 of the 4 barrels and was on her last trip, her body screaming for rest. Her movements had become slower, less steady, her focus blurred by a haze of heat and fatigue. Wade was in the open doorway of the barn, mending a piece of tack. The barn offered a sliver of shade, a small respite from the direct assault of the sun. He worked with his head down, his hands moving with a familiar, practiced skill over the worn leather. But his attention was not entirely on his task. For days, he had been a silent, unwilling observer of the woman in his kitchen. And now, he found his gaze drifting toward the well more often than he would ever admit. He saw her, a solitary, gray-clad figure moving back and forth under the brutal sun. A slow, painful metronome marking the time. He saw the slight but persistent unevenness of her gait, a detail that had etched itself into his awareness. He told himself he was merely ensuring the work got done. It was a lie, and the part of him that was still honest knew it. Eliza set one full bucket down and went to retrieve the second. As she bent to lift it, her bad foot, the one she favored, slipped on a slick patch of mud. For a terrifying half-second, she fought for balance, her arms windmilling, her body twisting in a desperate attempt to stay upright. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips, but her exhausted muscles and her protesting ankle betrayed her. Her leg gave way completely, and she went down. It was not a gentle fall. She landed hard on her side, the breath driven from her lungs in a sharp whoosh. The heavy wooden bucket she had been holding crashed to the ground beside her, its contents exploding in a wave of cold water that soaked her dress and turned the dust around her to instant mud. The other bucket, still full, tipped over with a loud, metallic clang that echoed across the silent yard like a gunshot. For a moment, she lay stunned in the puddle of water and mud, the white-hot sun beating down on her, the world a dizzying blur. The sharp, sickening pain that shot up from her ankle was so intense it made her nauseous. In the barn doorway, Wade froze. The piece of leather and the awl in his hands fell to the dusty floor. Forgotten. He had seen it all, the slip, the desperate fight for balance, the final, graceless collapse. The clang of the bucket had snapped something taut inside him. The detached observer was gone, consumed in a sudden, violent rush of something he hadn't felt in years, alarm. He didn't think. He didn't weigh his options or consider the consequences of breaking his own rigid code of non-interference. He simply moved. He launched himself from the barn, his long legs covering the distance to the well in a matter of seconds. The yard, which he had always seen as a barrier between his world and hers, was suddenly just empty space to be crossed. Eliza was already trying to push herself up, her face pale and etched with pain, her teeth gritted. Humiliation was a feeling sharper than any physical ache. To be seen like this, weak and fallen, was an indignity she could not bear. She pushed a muddy hand against the ground, trying to get her good leg under her, but a fresh wave of agony from her ankle made her cry out, a low, guttural sound of pure pain. "Don't move," a voice commanded, low and rough. She looked up, her vision swimming, to see Wade Hawthorne kneeling beside her in the mud. His face, usually a mask of cold indifference, was now a storm of conflicted, unreadable emotions. He reached for her without hesitation, his large, calloused hands closing around her upper arms. "I'm all right," she managed to say, her voice trembling. She tried to pull away, to regain some semblance of control. "I can get up myself." "Be still," he said, his voice softer now, but with an edge of authority that permitted no argument. His grip was firm but not harsh, and he easily took her weight as he began to lift her. As he pulled her to a sitting position, her sodden skirt, heavy with water and mud, clung to her legs. It rode up just enough to expose her lower legs and ankles, and Wade saw it. He stopped, his motion frozen, leaving her half-sitting, half-lying in the mud. Supported by his strong hands, his gaze was no longer on her face but was locked on her left ankle. The ankle itself was already beginning to swell, a puffy, discolored testament to the fresh injury. A dark, ugly bruise was beginning to blossom just below the bone, a violent splash of purple against her pale skin. But it was not the new injury that held him captive. It was the old ones. Lacing across the delicate skin of her ankle and lower shin were a series of faint, silvery lines, scars that were long healed but unmistakable. One, a thin, straight line, looked as though it had been made by a blade. Another, near the bone, was a small, puckered circle, the ghost of a deep puncture. They were the hieroglyphs of a past trauma, a story of pain written permanently on her flesh. This was not the result of a simple, accidental limp. This was the evidence of something else, something deliberate and ugly. The world seemed to fall away. The oppressive heat, the vast Texas sky, the ranch he had built with his own 2 hands, it all disappeared. All he could see were those scars, the quiet sighs he had heard, the way she favored her leg, the careful, guarded way she moved through the world. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying moment of understanding. The wall he had so carefully constructed around his heart, the one meant to keep out all feeling, all complication, all connection, was breached. Not by a word, not by a look, but by the silent, irrefutable testimony of these old wounds. Eliza felt his grip tighten, saw where his gaze was fixed. A deep, burning shame washed over her. These were the marks she had kept hidden for years, the map of a life she was desperately trying to leave behind. For him to see them felt like a violation, a stripping away of the final layer of her defenses. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice raw with a mixture of pain and mortification. "Please, I can manage." He heard her, but the words seemed to come from a great distance. He slowly lifted his gaze from her ankle to her face, and, for the first time, he was not looking at his cook. He was looking at a woman who had endured a hell he could not begin to imagine, a woman who had somehow survived it and carried its remnants with her every single day. He saw the fierce pride in her eyes, a desperate plea for him to ignore what he had just seen, to let her keep her dignity intact. He did not let go. His hands remained on her arms, a solid, grounding presence. The hardness in his own eyes had been replaced by a raw, unguarded expression of shock and a dawning, terrible empathy. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can't." And with that, he adjusted his grip, sliding one arm securely around her back, the other under her knees. In one powerful, fluid motion, he lifted her from the ground. She was surprisingly light in his arms. He could feel the fine tremor of pain that ran through her body as he moved. And he held her tighter, a strange, fiercely protective instinct rising up from a place within him he had thought long dead. She was too shocked, too overwhelmed by pain and surprise, to protest further. She could only lie stiffly in his arms as he carried her away from the well, away from the spilled water and the fallen buckets, his long strides sure and steady on the dusty ground. He was carrying her toward the house, toward the kitchen she had made her own. He had crossed the yard. He had breached the distance. And as he stepped onto the porch, carrying her through the doorway of the house where he had sworn to keep himself separate and alone, they both knew, in the charged and heavy silence between them, that nothing would ever be the same again. He carried her into the kitchen and set her down gently on one of the sturdy wooden chairs by the work table, his movements careful, almost hesitant, as if he were handling something fragile that might break. The brief, intense journey from the well to the house had been a silent one, charged with a tension so thick it felt like a third presence in the room. Eliza sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, her face a pale mask of pain and mortification. Wade stood over her, his large frame seeming to fill the entire room, his expression a chaotic mixture of anger, concern, and profound confusion. The wall between them had been irrevocably breached. He had seen her scars. She had been forced to accept his help. The simple, brutal contract they had established, cook and employer. Function and need had been shattered. They were now just a man and a woman, alone in a quiet room, suddenly and shockingly aware of each other's wounds. Wade's first instinct was to retreat, to flee back to the safety of the barn, to the uncomplicated world of horses and leather. But he couldn't. The image of her lying in the mud, the sight of those old scars on her ankle, had chained him to the spot. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and loud in the stillness. "Stay put," he commanded, the words coming out harsher than he intended. He turned from her and strode to the back of the kitchen, disappearing into her small room. He returned a moment later with the only other piece of furniture. It contained a small, low stool. He placed it on the floor in front of her. "Put your foot up." Eliza looked from the stool to his face, her eyes filled with a guarded, questioning light. She said nothing. "Do it," he said, his voice softer this time, but still firm. Slowly, wincing as she moved. She lifted her injured leg and rested her ankle on the stool. The relief was instantaneous and immense, and a soft sigh escaped her lips. Wade's gaze flickered to her ankle, now swollen and puffy. The bruise a violent, dark bloom beneath the skin. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tight, before turning away abruptly. He grabbed a bucket, went to the pump, and returned with fresh, cold water. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack, soaked it, and knelt before her. He did not ask for permission. He simply took her foot in his hand, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were so calloused and hard, and wrapped the cool, wet cloth around her swollen ankle. Eliza flinched at the initial contact, a lifetime of guarding herself against unwanted touch rising up in a wave of pure instinct. But his hold was impersonal, his focus entirely on the task. It was not the touch of a man, but of a caregiver, awkward and unpracticed, but utterly resolute. "I can do it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He ignored her, his attention fixed on securing the makeshift compress. "Be still," he grunted. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, kneeling and sitting in the quiet kitchen, bound together by this silent act of care. The sun beat down outside, but inside, the world had narrowed to this small, charged space. When he was done, he stood up, his face a stony mask once more. "You'll do your work from that chair for the rest of the day," he said. It was an order, not a suggestion. "If I see you stand on that foot, I'll tie you to it." Without another word, he turned and left, the screen door slamming shut behind him, leaving Eliza alone with her throbbing ankle and a maelstrom of confusing, contradictory feelings. That single pivotal moment in the yard changed the silent rhythm of the ranch. The changes were small, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but to the two people at the heart of them, they were seismic. They communicated not with words, but with a new language of quiet, practical gestures. The next morning, when Eliza rose in the pre-dawn darkness and limped into the kitchen, she found that the 4 large water barrels on the back porch were already filled to the brim, the wood around them still dark and damp. She stopped in the doorway, staring at them, a strange tightness in her chest. She knew, without a single word being spoken, who had filled them, and she knew why. It became a new ritual. Every morning, Wade would rise before her and perform the one task that had led to her fall. He did it silently, efficiently, and was usually gone to the far pastures before she even entered the kitchen. He never mentioned it, she never acknowledged it, but the full barrels stood as a daily, unspoken message. "I see your burden. Let me carry this part of it for you." Another change occurred at the dinner table. Eliza, as was her habit, always ate last, after the men were finished, making her own meal from whatever remained. A few days after her fall, Wade finished his meal, pushed his chair back, and stood. But instead of leaving, he picked up a clean plate. He walked to the stove, took the pot of beef stew, and ladled a generous portion onto the plate, making sure to get the largest pieces of meat and vegetables. He added a hot biscuit from the warming oven, and then, without looking at her, he walked to the clean end of her work table and set the plate down. "Eat," he said to the empty air, and then he was gone. The 2 ranch hands, Silas and Tom, watched this silent exchange with wide, curious eyes. They exchanged a quick, knowing glance, but said nothing. From that day on, a plate was always set for her before the men served themselves. It was another unspoken declaration, a simple act that elevated her from a mere servant to a member of the household, someone whose needs were to be considered. In return, Eliza's gratitude was expressed in her work. The stews became richer, the bread softer. She found a small stash of dried apples in the back of the pantry, and one afternoon, baked a deep-dish apple pie, its cinnamon-scented aroma filling the house with a warmth that went far beyond the heat of the stove. It was a taste of comfort, of home, in a place that had long been just a shelter. When Wade took his first bite, his relentless chewing slowed for a moment. He closed his eyes, just for a second, and in that fleeting stillness, Eliza saw the ghost of a different man, one who remembered what it was like to feel something other than loss, freed from the most grueling of her physical tasks and sustained by better nourishment. A slow, subtle transformation began in Eliza. The deep, weary lines around her eyes began to soften. The guarded, hunted look that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. Her world was still small and her future uncertain, but in this strange, silent partnership with the grim man who was her employer, she had found a small, safe harbor. One evening, as she was clearing the supper dishes, a rare moment of levity broke the usual mess hall silence. Young Tom, barely a man, was telling a rambling homespun story about trying to shoe a particularly stubborn mule. His tale was clumsy and unpolished, but it was filled with the earnest, simple humor of youth. Old Silas, a man as weathered and taciturn as Wade himself, let out a short, rusty bark of a laugh at the punchline. "Fool kid," Silas grumbled, though there was a rare twinkle in his eye. "You're lucky that mule didn't kick your head clean off." Tom grinned, his face flushed with pride at having made the old man laugh. As Eliza reached to take Silas's empty plate, she caught the tail end of their exchange, and a sound, soft and entirely unexpected, slipped from her lips. It was not a full laugh, but a light, breathy chuckle, a sound of pure, unthinking amusement. Her lips, usually held in a firm, straight line, curved into a small, genuine smile. The effect on the room was instantaneous. Silas's grumbling ceased. Tom's grin froze on his face. They both stared at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head. And Wade, sitting at the head of the table, went utterly still. He had been watching her, as he so often did now, from under the brim of his hat. He saw the smile transform her face, chasing away the shadows and revealing a glimpse of the woman she might have been in another life. He heard that soft laugh, a sound as foreign in this house as birdsong in winter. It was a sound of warmth, of life, of a spirit that had not been entirely broken by whatever horrors she had endured. It was the sound of his late wife. Sarah. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Sarah had laughed like that, a soft, musical sound that had once filled every corner of this house, a sound he had brutally and systematically purged from his memory because it was too painful to recall. The smile vanished from Eliza's face as quickly as it had appeared. She saw the three men staring at her, saw the look of raw, naked shock on Wade's face. The color drained from her cheeks. She had forgotten herself. She had broken the unspoken rule. She had made herself visible. Without a word, she gathered the rest of the plates and fled back to the safety of the kitchen, her heart hammering with a familiar, cold dread. That night, Wade did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed in his dark, Spartan room for hours, the silence of the house pressing in on him. But it was no longer an empty silence. It was filled with the echo of that one, soft sound, Eliza's laugh. It haunted him. It was a ghost, but not a ghost of the past. It was a ghost of what could be, a ghost of life intruding upon his carefully curated tomb. For years, his grief had been a quiet, predictable companion. It was a pain he understood, a pain he could manage. This new feeling, this strange disturbance caused by the memory of a woman's smile, was something else entirely. It was confusing, it was unwelcome, and it was undeniably powerful. He rose and walked out onto the porch, needing the vast, empty darkness of the plains to match the turmoil inside him. The stars were a cold, distant scatter of light in the infinite blackness. He stood there for a long time, a solitary figure wrestling with the slow, painful, and terrifying resurrection of his own heart. The quiet woman in his kitchen, the one with the haunted eyes and the silent limp, had done more damage to his fortress of solitude in a few short weeks than the long, lonely years had ever managed. She had not asked for his help. She had not offered her story. She had simply existed, and her quiet, resilient presence was slowly, inexorably, beginning to save him from himself, and he didn't know if he could bear it. The air, which for days had been thin and punishingly hot, began to change as the sun bled out across the horizon. It grew thick, heavy, and still, carrying a strange, metallic scent like ozone and damp earth. The sky in the west was not the usual gentle palette of orange and pink, but a violent canvas of bruised purple and a sickly, sulphurous yellow. The cattle in the near pasture were restless, moving in tight, nervous bunches and lowing softly into the oppressive quiet. Even the relentless wind seemed to be holding its breath, gathering its strength for a coming onslaught. Inside the ranch house, the silence was just as heavy. Wade sat on the porch, his chair tilted back against the wall, his eyes on the menacing sky. He had seen skies like this before. They were a prelude to violence, a warning that the land was about to unleash the full force of its untamed fury. He felt a familiar, primal tension coiling in his gut, the instinct of a man who had long learned to respect the raw power of the wilderness. Eliza worked in the kitchen, the lamplight casting a warm, steady glow that seemed a fragile bastion against the encroaching gloom. She moved with a newfound, careful grace. Though the swelling in her ankle had subsided, a deep ache remained, a constant reminder of her body's fragility. The unspoken truce between her and Wade had settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm. He performed his self-appointed tasks, the water barrels, the firewood, with a grim, unwavering consistency. She, in turn, expressed her gratitude through the care she put into her cooking. They orbited each other like two distant, wounded planets, held in place by a gravity of shared loneliness and unspoken understanding. The storm broke just after darkness had fully fallen. It did not arrive gently. The first gust of wind hit the house like a physical blow, rattling the window panes in their frames and moaning a low, mournful note under the eaves. Then came the thunder, not a distant rumble, but a sudden, deafening crack that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. The house trembled, and then the rain began. It was a deluge, a solid, vertical wall of water that hammered against the roof and walls with the relentless, percussive roar of a cavalry charge. All other sounds were obliterated, swallowed by the storm's vast, elemental fury. The world outside the windows was a churning, liquid blackness, occasionally illuminated by jagged, ghostly flashes of lightning. Wade had come inside, closing and barring the heavy front door against the storm's assault. He stood by the window in the main room, watching the maelstrom, a dark, solitary figure silhouetted against the violent flashes of light. Eliza, finished with her kitchen chores, sat at the long mess hall table, ostensibly mending one of Tom's shirts, though her hands were still, her senses entirely consumed by the power of the storm. It was then that they both heard it, a sound that was not the wind or the rain, a small, rhythmic, and utterly out-of-place noise. Plink, plink, plink. It was the sound of water striking wood, steady and persistent. Eliza's head came up, her brow furrowed. Wade turned from the window, his expression hardening. The sound was coming from the corner of the main room, the large, sparsely furnished space that was Wade's exclusive domain. It was the room where his wife's rocking chair still sat, empty and silent, by the cold, cavernous fireplace. A dark, wet patch was spreading rapidly across the ceiling boards, and from its center, A steady stream of water was dripping onto the floor. The house, his fortress, had been breached. Eliza rose immediately, her practical nature taking over. A leak like this could warp the floorboards, ruin what little furniture there was. She limped quickly into the kitchen and returned with a large tin bucket. The drip was located in an awkward spot, directly over a tall, dusty bookshelf that held a collection of ledgers and thick, leather-bound books. "I'll get a ladder from the barn," Wade said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's roar. "There's no time," Eliza called back over the din. "It will be soaked through by the time you return." Before he could protest, she had already taken matters into her own hands. She dragged a sturdy-looking wooden crate from near the fireplace, her movements quick and decisive. She placed it directly beneath the leak, her intention clear. "Eliza, don't," Wade said, taking a step toward her. There was a sharp, new edge to his voice. "It's just a crate, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her focus on the task. "I need the height to place the bucket." She saw this as her duty, a problem to be solved, and she would not be deterred. Her pride, her fierce independence, would not allow her to stand by and do nothing. "That crate is unsteady. Wait for me," he commanded, his voice rising now, cutting through the thunder. But she was already climbing, lifting the heavy bucket in her hands. She placed her good foot on the crate, pushing herself up. For a moment, she was steady, but as she shifted her weight to bring her injured leg up, the crate wobbled on the uneven floorboards. She reached up, trying to place the bucket on top of the bookshelf, stretching to her full height. It happened in a heartbeat. Her bad ankle, unable to bear the sudden, awkward strain, gave a sickening twist. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg. She cried out, a sound that was half surprise, half agony. Her balance was gone. The crate tipped, the bucket flew from her grasp, and she fell. Wade saw it happen in a surreal, horrifying slow motion. He saw the crate lurch, saw the look of alarm flash across her face, heard her sharp cry. He lunged forward, his own name a strangled roar in his throat, but he was too late. She landed in a heap on the floor, the empty bucket clattering beside her, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. He was at her side in an instant, his heart hammering against his ribs with a terror so cold and so absolute it nearly choked him. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her, unsure of where to touch. "Eliza," he said, his voice a raw, ragged thing. She was pushing herself up, her face chalk white, her lips pressed into a thin line to keep from screaming. I'm all right," she gasped, but it was a blatant, desperate lie. And then the fear, the cold, paralyzing terror of seeing her fall, of hearing her cry of pain, ignited. It erupted from him not as comfort, not as concern, but as a white-hot, uncontrollable rage. It was the only way his grief-stricken, emotionally stunted heart knew how to process an emotion this powerful. "What in God's name did you think you were doing?" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip in the suddenly quiet space between thunderclaps. He grabbed her arm, pulling her to a sitting position, his touch rough with a desperate, furious energy. Eliza flinched, shocked more by the violence of his tone than by his touch. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Are you a fool?" he demanded, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing with a wild, terrifying light. "Climbing on a rickety crate in the middle of a storm, you could have broken your neck." The injustice of his anger, the sheer, unadulterated unfairness of it, cut through her pain and ignited a fire of her own. "I was trying to stop the leak," she shot back, her voice trembling with a defiant fury. "I was trying to take care of your house." "I told you to wait." "And I told you there wasn't time. Would you rather I let the rain ruin your floor and your books?" She tried to pull her arm from his grasp, her own anger a shield for her pain and humiliation. "I am not a child. Mr. Hawthorne, I don't need you to hover over me. I have been taking care of myself for a very long time." "And a fine job you've made of it," he retorted, the cruel words escaping him before he could stop them. His furious gaze dropped to her leg, twisted beneath her. "Is that how you got that ankle in the first place? By refusing to listen to anyone? By being so damn stubborn you'd rather break yourself than accept a moment of help?" The accusation struck her with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from her face, leaving it ashen. The fire in her eyes died, replaced by a look of such profound, devastating hurt that it finally pierced his wall of rage. He saw her flinch as if he had slapped her. He saw the ghosts of 1,000 other cruel words, 1,000 other unjust accusations, rise up in her eyes, and his anger shattered. It fell away in an instant, leaving behind the raw, terrifying truth of what lay beneath it, fear. He was terrified. He had watched her fall, and in that split second, he had been plunged back into the black, helpless abyss of watching someone he cared about suffer, of being powerless to stop it. His rage had not been at her. It had been a blind, desperate railing against his own fear, against the ghost of his own loss. He looked down at his hand, still clamped around her arm. He saw the white of his knuckles, the imprint his fingers were making on her skin. A wave of self-loathing washed over him. He was a brute. He was no better than the past that had left those scars on her ankle. He released her as if his hand had been burned. "Eliza," he said, his voice now a broken, hollow whisper. But he had no words. What could he say? He had taken her pain and her pride and used them as a weapon against her. The fight had gone out of her completely. Her defiance crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The pain in her ankle, the shock of the fall, and the sharp, brutal sting of his words were too much to bear. A low sob escaped her lips. That small, broken sound finished the demolition of his defenses. He reached for her again, but this time his movements were slow, gentle, infinitely tender. He slid his arms under her, one beneath her back, the other under her knees, and lifted her as easily as if she were a child. He carried her to the horsehair sofa that sat before the fireplace, the one piece of furniture that held any memory of comfort. He laid her down gently, his touch now filled with a deep, aching remorse. The storm still raged outside, but inside the house, a new, fragile, and terrifyingly intimate silence had fallen. He knelt before her, his gaze fixed on her face. "I am sorry," he said, the words costing him more than any physical labor ever had. "My anger, it was not for you. I was afraid." It was the most honest thing he had said to another human being in years. Eliza looked at him, her eyes still swimming with tears, and she saw the truth of it in his face. She saw the raw fear, the deep, abiding grief that he carried like a shroud. And in that moment of shared, devastating honesty, she understood him. She didn't answer. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The storm had broken, both outside and in. And in the wreckage, amidst the raw, painful debris of their argument, something new and fragile had begun to take root. The weeks following the storm fell into a new kind of quiet. It was no longer the stark, empty silence of two strangers coexisting in a shared space, but a fragile, tentative peace. Like the stillness that follows a fever, the argument, raw and painful as it had been, had acted like a lightning strike, shattering the hardened ground between them and allowing something new and uncertain to take root. Words remained a scarce commodity on the Triple H, but they were no longer necessary. Wade and Eliza had found a different language, one spoken in the silent dialect of action and observation. One morning, Eliza came into the kitchen to find the wobbly leg of her work stool, the one that had vexed her for weeks, was now firm and steady. A small, expertly carved wedge of wood hammered securely into the joint. She never mentioned it. He never took credit for it. But the next evening, a small plate with 2 extra molasses cookies, still warm from the oven, was waiting for him on the porch rail where he often sat after supper. He began to talk, not to her, but in her presence. He would direct comments about the weather or a troublesome steer to Silas or Tom during meals. But his voice was pitched for the entire room, a subtle invitation for her to be part of the ranch's small, circumscribed world. And she, in turn, began to hum as she worked, soft, half-forgotten melodies from a life before this one. The sound was quiet, almost subliminal, but it filled the sterile silence of the house with a gentle, persistent warmth. The house was beginning to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. The change was slow, delicate, and entirely unspoken. And for that very reason, it was profoundly vulnerable. After a month, the pantry's shelves were growing bare. It was time for a supply run into redemption. Usually, Jedediah went alone, but the list Eliza had prepared was long and specific, full of things like yeast cakes, cinnamon, and a particular type of sewing needle that the old ranch hand would never find on his own. "You'll have to go with him," Wade had stated at breakfast, not looking at her. "Make sure he gets what's needed." The prospect of going into town filled Eliza with a strange mixture of apprehension and a faint, surprising flicker of anticipation. She had not left the isolating confines of the Triple H since the day she arrived. The thought of seeing other faces, of walking down a street, of being in a place that wasn't saturated with the silent, brooding presence of Wade Hawthorne, felt both daunting and liberating. The journey in the buckboard with Jedediah was as silent as her first, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was comfortable now, the easy quiet of two people accustomed to each other's presence. As they neared redemption, the sight of the familiar, sun-bleached buildings seemed strange and foreign to her. She had become accustomed to the vast, empty horizons of the ranch. The town felt small, cluttered, and loud. Jedediah pulled the wagon up in front of the Redemption Mercantile, a long, low building with a covered boardwalk and large windows displaying everything from bolts of calico to sacks of grain. "Take your time, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'll be over at the blacksmith's." Eliza stepped down from the wagon, smoothing the front of her clean but well-worn gray dress. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness. She was the ranch cook, a widow from the East, a stranger. She could feel the weight of eyes upon her as she walked across the dusty street, the idle curiosity of men loafing on the saloon porch, the quick, assessing glances of women sweeping their own boardwalks. The bell above the mercantile door jingled softly as she entered. The air inside was cool and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried lavender. It was a place of comforting order and abundance. The proprietor, a stout woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and a pair of spectacles perched on her nose, was named Martha Peabody. Her face was a mask of professional, slightly pursed cordiality. "Help you, ma'am?" she asked, her eyes flicking over Eliza's simple attire. "I have a list for the Hawthorne Ranch," Eliza said, her voice quiet. "Mrs." Peabody's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The cordiality became sharper, tinged with a new, keen-edged curiosity. "Ah, yes, Mr. Hawthorne's new cook." Eliza handed her the list, and for a time, she busied herself examining bolts of fabric, her fingers tracing the patterns on the crisp cotton. She needed to mend one of her two dresses and was debating the small extravagance of a few yards of plain blue calico. The mercantile was quiet, with only one other customer, a tall, gaunt woman with a sour expression who was inspecting a display of canned peaches. It was then that she heard the voices from the front counter. "Where Mrs." Peabody was now talking to the other woman. They were whispers at first, the sibilant, conspiratorial hisses of women sharing gossip. But as they grew more comfortable in their judgments, their voices rose just enough to be carried on the still, cool air of the store. "All the way from back east, they say," came the sour-faced woman's voice. "On her own. You have to wonder what she was running from." Mrs. Peabody snorted, the sound like a bag of beans being dropped. I've seen her kind before, quiet as a mouse, but still waters run deep. I always say, a lone woman in that house, with a man like Wade Hawthorne. Eliza froze, her hand hovering over a bolt of blue fabric. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy, sickening rhythm against her ribs. They were talking about her. It's not proper, the sour woman declared, her voice filled with a righteous, satisfying indignation. He hasn't had a woman in that house since Sarah passed. And now this one shows up. They say old Jedediah practically has to run the supply wagon in circles. The list of things she needs is so long. Putting on airs, if you ask me. He's been seen in town twice this past month. Mrs. Peabody added, her voice dropping to a scandalized whisper. Twice. He's been looking different, less wild-eyed. You mark my words. Cora, she knows what she's about, that one. Eliza felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, prickling wave of shame. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the floorboards. She stood motionless, trapped, forced to listen to them dissect her life, her character, her very existence, and twist it into something ugly and conniving. Then came the final, brutal blow, delivered with the casual cruelty of a hangman. That widow's got her hooks in him, good and proper, Cora Gable said with a decisive nod. Trying to cook her way into becoming the next Mrs. Hawthorne. It's as plain as the nose on your face. The words struck Eliza with the force of a physical slap. The fragile sense of peace she had cultivated, the quiet dignity she had fought so hard to maintain, was shattered, reduced to the sordid, grasping ambition of a scheming widow. They saw her not as a survivor, but as a predator. They saw Wade's small, hesitant acts of kindness not as the stirrings of a healing heart, but as the foolish stumblings of a man being ensnared. She couldn't breathe. The air in the store was suddenly thick and suffocating. She turned from the fabric, her list forgotten, her face a pale, set mask. She walked to the counter, her limp more pronounced than it had been in weeks. The two women fell silent the moment they saw her, their faces freezing in masks of feigned innocence, though a faint, malicious gleam remained in their eyes. "Is my order ready?" Eliza asked, her voice tight and cold. "Most of it, dear." "Mrs." Peabody said with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Just the flour and the salt pork to be weighed out?" "Just the items on the counter. Then I'll take them now," Eliza said. She could not bear to be in this place a moment longer. She paid for the small stack of goods with the money Wade had given her, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. She did not meet their eyes. She could feel their smug, judgmental gazes burning into her back as she turned and walked out of the store, the bell above the door jingling a final, mocking farewell. The journey back to the Triple H was a descent into a cold, bleak silence. The fragile peace of the morning was gone, replaced by the howling emptiness of Eliza's own thoughts. The women's words echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh lash of shame. Got her hooks in him, trying to become the next Mrs. Hawthorne. She had been a fool. She had allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope, a sense of belonging. She had mistaken a man's reluctant decency for something more. And the world, the harsh, unforgiving world outside the ranch, had been quick to remind her of her place. She was a hired cook, a widow with a past, a woman who would always be judged, always be suspect. When they arrived back at the ranch, she worked with a grim, mechanical efficiency, unloading the supplies and putting them away. The moment she entered the kitchen, she began to rebuild the wall around herself, brick by painful brick. That evening, the change was palpable. The tentative warmth that had begun to permeate the house was gone, sucked out as if a window had been thrown open to a winter storm. Eliza served the meal in a stony silence. She moved like an automaton, her face expressionless, her eyes fixed on the floor, on the table, on anything but the faces of the men. She was once again a function, a pair of hands, She was invisible. Wade felt the shift immediately. The air was cold again. The food was just as good, but it was served without the quiet hum of her presence. The house felt empty, just as it had before she came. But now, the emptiness was no longer a familiar comfort. It was a profound and aching loss. When he finished his meal, he fixed a plate for her as he had done for weeks and placed it on the work table. She was at the sink, her back to him, a rigid, unyielding line. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice flat and formal. She did not turn. She did not touch the plate. He stood there for a moment, a frown creasing his brow. The soft humming he had grown accustomed to, the sound that had become the quiet underscore to his evenings, was absent. The house was utterly silent, save for the clink of cutlery. He felt a surge of a frustration he couldn't name, a sense of being robbed of something he hadn't even realized he possessed. What had happened? What had changed? He looked at her stiff, retreating back, and for the first time, he understood that the fragile peace he had begun to find was not something he had built alone. It had been a quiet, collaborative effort, and now his collaborator had withdrawn, leaving him once again in the cold, familiar grip of his own solitude, and it was no longer enough. The days that followed were an exercise in regression. The fragile warmth that had seeped into the corners of the Triple H ranch house vanished as if it had never been, leaving behind a chill more profound and penetrating than the one Eliza had first encountered. The house was once again a place of ghosts, but now they were not just the ghosts of the past, but the fresh, aching specters of a connection that had been deliberately and methodically dismantled. Eliza moved through her days with the silent, flawless precision of a well-oiled machine. She rose in the dark, she lit the fire, she cooked the meals, she cleaned the kitchen, and she retired to her room. But the spirit had gone out of the work. The food she prepared was technically perfect. The biscuits were light, the stews were hearty, the coffee was strong, but it was sustenance devoid of soul. The humming had ceased. The soft, unconscious melodies that had become a part of the house's new atmosphere were gone, replaced by an unnerving, absolute silence. She was a phantom in gray, performing her duties with an efficiency that was itself a form of armor. She never met Wade's eyes. When he spoke in her presence, she would find a sudden, urgent task at the sink or in the pantry. When he left a plate for her on the work table, she would wait until he was long gone before clearing it away, often untouched. She was erasing herself from his world, retreating behind a wall of polite, impenetrable duty. Wade was a man adrift in a sea of confusion. He felt the change in the house like a drop in barometric pressure, a physical weight in the air that signaled a coming storm. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt like an accusation. The absence of her quiet humming left a void that was louder than any noise. He found himself watching her, searching for a clue, a sign, but her face was a calm, placid mask that revealed nothing. His frustration grew with each passing day. It was a dull, unfamiliar ache in his chest, a feeling of being locked out of a room he hadn't even known he wanted to enter. One evening, he slammed his empty coffee mug down on the table with a loud crack that made Silas and Tom jump. Eliza, who was at the hearth, didn't even flinch. She simply continued her work, her back a rigid, unforgiving line. The small act of violence had been completely ignored, rendering his frustration impotent and foolish. He felt a surge of raw, helpless anger and stormed out of the house, the screen door banging shut behind him. For Eliza, each day was a new layer of torment. The cruel words of the women in town played on a ceaseless loop in her mind. That widow's got her hooks in him good and proper. A dress that can cook. Every small kindness Wade had shown her, every silent gesture of care, was now tainted, twisted by the town's ugly interpretation. His filling the water barrels, his fixing her stool, his setting a plate for her in her memory. These acts were no longer proof of a healing heart. but evidence for the prosecution in the court of public opinion. She realized with a sickening clarity that she could not stay. To remain would be to tacitly accept their judgment, to allow her presence to become a stain on his reputation as well as her own. Her dignity, the fierce, battered pride that had carried her through the darkest years of her life, was the only true possession she had left. She would not allow it to be sold for the price of a steady roof and 3 meals a day. The decision was made late one night, as she lay on her narrow cot, listening to the lonely cry of a coyote. The sound echoed the profound emptiness she felt in her own soul. Tomorrow, she would leave. She would walk away with the same single carpetbag with which she had arrived. She had nothing to go back to, and no destination in mind. But the unknown was less terrifying than the slow, public erosion of her self-worth. She rose an hour earlier than usual. In the deepest part of the night, when the darkness is absolute and the stars seem their brightest, she moved without a lamp, her hands and feet knowing the geography of the small room and the kitchen by heart. She dressed quickly and packed her few belongings into her worn bag, her other dress, her brush, the small, leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her mother. As a final act of duty, she moved into the dark kitchen. She built up the fire, put the coffee on to boil, and mixed a large batch of biscuit dough. She would not leave them without a breakfast. It was a matter of professional pride. On the work table, she placed the small leather pouch of coins that Wade had given her as her first month's wages. She had earned it, but she could not take it. To do so would be to validate the town's assessment of her as a woman for hire. Her work done, she took one last look around the kitchen. In the soft, flickering light from the stove, the room looked warm, alive. It was the one place in the world where she had felt a flicker of purpose, a sense of belonging. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away with an angry, impatient gesture. Then, she picked up her bag, slipped out the back door, and began to walk away from the house. A small, solitary figure swallowed by the immense, pre-dawn darkness. Wade woke with a start. The house was wrong. It was too quiet. He lay in his bed, listening, his senses on high alert. There was no gentle clink of metal from the kitchen, no soft thud of the biscuit dough being worked on the table, and there was no light. The thin sliver of illumination that usually appeared under his door when she began her work was absent. A cold, unfamiliar dread snaked its way into his gut. He threw back the covers and pulled on his trousers and boots in the dark. He walked through the silent house to the kitchen. It was empty. The fire in the stove was burning low. The coffee pot was warm, and a large bowl of biscuit dough sat covered on the table. But the room was devoid of her presence. Then he saw the small leather pouch of coins sitting squarely in the middle of the table. His blood ran cold. He strode to the back door and threw it open. The sky was just beginning to soften in the east, the darkness turning from black to a deep, velvety indigo. And he saw her. She was a small, determined silhouette moving steadily down the long track that led away from the ranch, her carpetbag clutched in her hand. Eliza! The name was a raw, guttural roar torn from his throat. She did not stop. She did not even slow her pace. He vaulted off the porch and ran, his long strides eating up the ground. The cold morning air burned in his lungs. He was not just running. He was chasing something, a fragile warmth, a nascent peace that he now realized he could not bear to lose. He caught up to her at the point where the ranch yard gave way to the open range, grabbing her arm and spinning her around to face him. "Where in the hell do you think you're going?" he demanded, his voice ragged with exertion and a furious, terrifying panic. Her face, in the pale, ghostly light of the approaching dawn, was calm, closed, and utterly remote. "I am leaving, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "My employment is terminated." "Terminated," he echoed, his grip on her arm tightening. "You don't terminate it. I do. We had an agreement." "The terms of the agreement have become untenable," she replied, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She refused to look him in the eye. His anger, born of fear and confusion, boiled over. "Untenable," he mocked, spitting the unfamiliar word back at her. "You eat my food? You live under my roof. And then you just decide to walk out in the middle of the night. You leave my money on the table like it's an insult. What kind of game are you playing?" That broke through her composure. Her eyes, blazing with a sudden, fierce light, finally met his. "This is not a game," she cried, her voice trembling with a long-suppressed fury. "This is my life, the only one I have." "Then why are you throwing it away? What happened in town? What did they say to you?" he demanded, his mind finally connecting her sudden withdrawal to the supply run. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "What did they say? They said what they always say about women like me. Women who are alone. They said I am a schemer. They said I have my hooks in you. They said I am nothing more than a dress that can cook, trying to trap a lonely man into marriage." The raw, ugly words hung in the cold air between them. Wade stared at her, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. The sheer, venomous cruelty of it left him speechless. "And you believe them," he finally managed to say, his voice low and dangerous. "You'd let the gossip of a few bitter old women drive you out into the wilderness." "It is not about believing them," she shot back, yanking her arm from his grasp. "It is about knowing how the world works, your kindness, your help." She stumbled over the word. "It is not seen as decency. It is seen as weakness. My gratitude is not seen as respect. It is seen as ambition. For me to stay here now, under your protection, is to prove them right. It makes a liar out of your charity and a whore out of my need." "To hell with them," he growled, taking a step toward her. "To hell with the whole damn town. This is my land. What I do in my own house is my business." "It is my name, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice dropping to a low, painful whisper, but losing none of its steel. "It is my reputation. It is all I have left to call my own, and I will not have it soiled. Not for you, not for anyone." He saw the unbreakable resolve in her eyes. He saw a pride so fierce and so deeply ingrained that it would rather choose death in the wilderness than life under the shadow of dishonor. His anger, his frustration, it was all useless against this. He was losing her. The house would be silent again. The ghosts would return. The cold would settle back into his bones. Colder this time because he now knew the warmth he was losing. Panic seized him, raw and absolute. He reached for her again, but this time his touch was not angry. It was desperate. His fingers closed around her arm. A plea, not a command. "Don't go," he said, the words rough and unfamiliar in his throat. He struggled, a man drowning, searching for the right words, words he had not used in a lifetime. The work, the ranch, needs a cook. It was a pathetic, flimsy argument, and they both knew it. She simply looked at him, her expression a mixture of pity and sorrow. "You will find another," she said softly. He shook his head, a desperate, violent motion. His carefully constructed walls, his pride, his solitude, it all crumbled to dust in that one moment. He looked at her, and for the first time, he allowed her to see past the hardened rancher, past the grieving widower, and into the desperate, lonely heart of the man. "This isn't about the cooking," he said, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, the admission costing him everything. "It was, at first, but not anymore." He took a ragged breath, the words coming now in a raw, unstoppable torrent of truth. "You are not the woman I hired, Eliza." She stared at him, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. The dawn was breaking behind him, casting his face in shadow but outlining his powerful frame in a halo of pale gold light. "You are the woman I need." The words hung in the vast, silent space between them, more real and more solid than the ground beneath their feet. You are the woman I need. It was not a declaration of love, not a poetic verse from a book. It was something rawer, something more fundamental. It was a confession of a starving man admitting his hunger, of a man lost in the dark, admitting his need for light. It was the most vulnerable, terrifying, and profoundly honest thing Eliza had ever heard. Every defense she had meticulously constructed, every brick of pride and righteous anger she had used to build the wall around her heart, crumbled to dust under the weight of that simple, brutal admission. The cruel whispers of the town, the shame, the fear, it all became a distant, buzzing noise in the face of this stark and desperate truth. He was not trying to possess her, to trap her, or to use her. He was simply, finally, seeing her. He saw past the cook, past the widow, past the woman with the limp, and saw the essential, irreplaceable core of her. And he had found it necessary. She stared at him, the pale light of the rising sun illuminating the raw vulnerability in his eyes. The hard, granite lines of his face seemed to have softened, eroded by the force of his own confession. He stood before her not as the master of the ranch, not as a figure of authority, but as a man stripped bare, offering the broken, lonely pieces of himself for her consideration. Her own anger, her own fierce, protective pride, ebbed away, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strangely calm. She had been ready to fight him, to argue, to defend her decision to leave with every fiber of her being. But he had given her nothing to fight against. He had disarmed her with the one weapon she could not counter, his own defenselessness. He took a half step back, releasing his desperate grip on her arm. The physical connection was broken, but a new, invisible tether now stretched between them, humming with a tension that was both terrifying and electrifying. He did not plead. He did not cajole. He had laid his truth at her feet. And now, he was giving her the space to either step over it and walk away, or to stop and consider it. He was giving her the one thing she had never truly been given before, a choice. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house. He did not look back to see if she was following. He was entrusting his entire, fragile hope to her own free will. He walked not with the long, confident stride of the rancher, but with the slow, heavy gait of a man who had just wagered everything he had left in the world on a single, uncertain outcome. Eliza stood alone on the dusty track, her small carpetbag a dead weight in her hand. The sun was cresting the horizon now, spilling liquid gold across the vast, empty plains. The world was waking up, indifferent to the monumental, life-altering decision that rested on her shoulders. She looked down the long road that led away from the ranch, the road that led to what? Another town, another job as a cook. Another life of being invisible, of being judged and dismissed. A life of being safe, perhaps, but a life of being utterly, profoundly alone. Then she looked back at the ranch house. It stood dark and silent against the brightening sky. But it was no longer just a building to her. It was a place of warmth, of purpose, of quiet acts of care. It was the place where a broken, grieving man had learned to fill water barrels for a woman with a limp. It was the place where she had learned to hum again. It was the place where someone needed her. She was caught between two impossible choices. To leave was to preserve her name, to defy the cruel judgment of the world, to maintain the fierce, solitary independence that had been her only armor for so long. It was the safe path, the path of self-preservation. To stay was to open herself up to that judgment, to risk being seen as the very thing the townspeople accused her of being. It was to make herself vulnerable, not just to their gossip, but to the deep, uncharted territory of Wade Hawthorne's wounded heart, and to her own. It was the path of terrifying, uncertain hope. Her past life had taught her that hope was a dangerous indulgence, a fool's currency. But Wade's words echoed in her soul, challenging that bitter lesson. You are the woman I need. For the first time, someone's need for her felt not like a burden, but like a validation. It was an anchor in the storm of her life. Slowly, her fingers uncurled from the handle of her carpet bag. It fell to the dust with a soft, final thud. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cool morning air filling her lungs. And then she began to walk back toward the house. Wade did not go inside. He stopped on the porch, leaning his shoulder against a rough-hewn post, his arms crossed over his chest. He stood as still as a statue, his gaze fixed on the kitchen door, waiting. He did not know if he was waiting for the sound of her footsteps returning, or for the final, crushing silence that would mean she was gone forever. The sun climbed higher, warming his face, but a deep, wintry cold had settled in his bones. He had spent years cultivating his solitude, and now he discovered it was a prison of his own making, and he had just handed the only key to the one person who might be willing to set him free. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The usual morning sounds of the ranch began Silas and Tom emerging from the bunkhouse, the lowing of cattle, the distant whinny of a horse. They saw him standing on the porch, a grim, unmoving sentinel, and they knew something was wrong. They exchanged a look, grabbed their gear, and went about their chores, giving the main house a wide, respectful berth. The entire ranch seemed to be holding its breath. Eliza did not go directly to the kitchen. She entered through the back, slipping into her small room like a ghost. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The choice was not yet final. The walk back to the house was one thing, the act of staying was another. She looked at her meager possessions, the sum total of her worldly existence. To stay meant to unpack not just her dress and her Bible, but her heart, her history, her scars, and lay them all bare in this house. It meant trusting a man who was still half a stranger, a man whose own heart was a landscape of ruins. It was the greatest risk she had ever taken. She sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house, to the creak of the floorboards, to the sigh of the wind under the eaves. She thought of her late husband, a man whose need for her had been the need of a sick-room nurse. She thought of the creditors, whose need for her was the need of a vulture for a carcass. And she thought of Wade, whose need for her was something else entirely. It was the need for a companion in the silence, a fellow survivor in the wreckage of a life. A profound, quiet certainty settled over her. Her pride was not in her name, or in what a few bitter people in a dusty town thought of her. Her true pride was in her resilience, in her capacity to endure, in her ability to find and nurture life in the most barren of places. And the most barren place she had ever found was not the Texas plains, but the heart of the man waiting on the porch. To walk away now would not be an act of pride. It would be an act of fear. The sun was well above the horizon when Wade finally heard it. A sound from within the house, the soft, familiar scrape of the poker against the iron grates of the stove. His heart, which had been a cold, heavy stone in his chest, gave a single, powerful leap. He straightened up, his knuckles white where he gripped the porch post, but he did not move. He listened. He heard the clink of the coffee pot being placed on the stove. He heard the soft, rhythmic thud of a knife on the cutting board. He heard the quiet, purposeful sounds of his world being put back in order. He waited until he could smell the rich, life-affirming aroma of brewing coffee. Then, slowly, as if in a dream, he pushed himself away from the post and walked to the kitchen door. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the opening. She was at the stove, her back to him. The early morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air and casting her in a soft, warm glow. She moved with her usual quiet efficiency, her limp a familiar, graceful rhythm in the choreography of her work. She did not turn. She did not speak. She did not have to. Her presence was the only answer he needed. He watched her for a long time. The simple, domestic scene before him more beautiful and more moving than any sunset he had ever witnessed. She was not a cook. She was not a widow. She was Eliza, and she was home. He walked to the table and sat down in his usual spot. The house was quiet, but it was not silent. It was filled with the soft, gentle sounds of a new day and of a new beginning. Eliza turned from the stove, a platter of freshly cooked bacon in her hands. She walked to the table and placed it in the center. Her hand brushed his as she set it down. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but a current of warmth passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the new and unspoken truth that now filled the space between them. She still did not meet his eyes, but a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. He looked at the simple meal before him, the bacon, the biscuits, the steaming coffee. It was the same breakfast he had eaten 100 times before in this house, but today, it tasted like hope. He knew there would still be storms. There would still be pain. The world outside had not changed, but for the first time in a very long time, he knew he would not have to face it alone. She had stayed. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear from you. So please let us know where you're listening from in the comments below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story be heard by more people, please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button